Want to welcome you all to the final breakout session of the in-service. The day's almost done. You can get out and enjoy the weather. It's great to see a mix of residential and online instructors for this presentation. That's what I had hoped for, because this tool is not just an online tool, and it's not even just an online and hybrid tool, but it's a tool that anyone can use, especially if you want to do some flipped classrooms where you're doing more lecture online, and that way you can do more application in the classroom. This was an excellent tool for that. Or even if you do lecture in the classroom, you can still have lecture review quizzes that you post weekly to see how much students retained. So without further ado, let's get into it. All of you have probably seen this text come up in every unit of your course when it's loaded in. And it basically says this test covers the lecture material posted in this unit. And that's it. Every unit is the same, and every question on that quiz is the same. Please submit 2-3 sentences on the lecture material. Well, when we created these lecture reviews, when we started the 6-week format, they were intended to be one of the few assessments, especially for online, since we're not really allowed to change assignments and tests and quizzes. This is one of the few things that you're allowed to change. And this verbiage that we put in here was kind of a cover-all, a catch-all phrase that anyone could use, but it was meant to be a placeholder. It was not meant to be the actual quiz. And because of that, we didn't really put any notes in there telling people they needed to change them. And you don't need to change them, but I highly encourage everyone that either delivers a lecture online or delivers a lecture in the classroom that they'd like to quiz their students on, to use this as a way to make this tool and this assessment more valuable to students. So what's the point of a lecture review? If we just read what we just read on the screen prior, it sounds to me like it's just to prove that they watched the lecture. You watched the lecture, you posted 2-3 sentences, you get all the points. And that's kind of how it's set up. The problem with that is there's no rigor involved, and there's really no need for them to listen closely to the lecture. If all they have to do is listen to the first minute of the lecture and write 3 sentences on that, they've got their points, and they really haven't taken anything away. So the point is, we want to make this assessment engaging. We want to make it engaging just like our lectures are engaging, and we want to make sure our students are engaged in our lectures and showing us that in these quizzes. And the 3 things we want to get out of this when we're creating our own lecture quizzes: we want them to have rigor, not just be put in 3 sentences and I'll give you all the points. But we want to make them actually rigorous so students are challenged in this. Second, we want it to have relevance. Relevance to what they just watched or listened to. Relevance to the topics that we're covering in this unit. And just relevance in general to the course. And finally, we need to build relationships between this quiz, the questions you're asking, and what they are learning in the course, and what they'll learn from the course for life. So it sounds like a lot, but it's really easy. And the best part about these lecture reviews is you can copy them from one section to the next. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to go into your previous section and copy these quizzes over, the verbiage over to your new course. So that way, if you create a really great series of lecture reviews for a certain class you teach, you can just keep reusing those over and over, and you don't have to reinvent them every time. It's a little more work than just using the stock phrase that's in there every week, but trust me, it will be much more beneficial to your students, and surprisingly, it will be much more beneficial to you. I'll show you why in a second here. So I've got a series of examples that I'll run through, and each one is slightly different and uses the lecture review in a slightly different way. Most of these I grabbed from actual people who are doing lecture reviews differently in their courses, and some of them I just kind of tweaked it to show a new way of thinking. Oh, that's great. Brenna already uses some variation in hers, and students really like it. They like not having to do the same 2 to 3 sentence every week. So here's the first way you can use them. You can make your lectures more active. Now, if you're teaching residentially and you want to use this tool, this is a great way for you to do it, because in class, at certain points, if you don't want to, you know how usually you're asking questions along the way, probing for examples, trying to get students involved. If you're doing it in a hybrid session or online, that's not really available for you when you're lecturing. It's basically, let me tell you about this, and I'll keep talking for 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, and you'll keep listening, and they'll just go on and on and on. But this gives you a chance to make a recorded lecture more of an active learning environment. What you get to do is, during your lecture, have some pauses where you ask them questions, where you ask them to comment on something, or to ask them to provide an example. And as they're listening, they're going to need to be writing down the questions that they're hearing, and then afterwards they're going to go into the lecture review quiz, as you can see the assignment directions say, and they will answer all the questions that you asked during the lecture. And you may even pose some theoretical questions that don't have a right or wrong answer. But that's great, because then when you grade this, you can provide the answers in your feedback. And that way you're creating this active environment where you're asking them questions, they're giving their best shot at it, you're telling them the answers, and it's very individualized in the way that it's delivered. Now, I'm gonna try this. I'm guessing it won't work, because usually in Skype, if you try to watch an external link, it won't do it. So I may end up, what I'm gonna do here is just open it in my own browser, but I just have an actual example of somebody who does this with a lot of success. And change this up now, present my desktop, and see if you guys can hear this. Once I start playing it, if you can't hear anything as you see the lecture is moving, let me know, and I'll just stop, because I'm not going to waste your time on something you can't hear. But let's just see at the beginning here if you guys can hear this. I heard nothing yet. Nobody's hearing anything. Okay. That was my fear. Anyway, I'll go to the end of this lecture, and at the end here, she's talking about managers versus leaders. At the end, she poses a few questions about, what do you think the difference between a manager and leader is? Where do you envision yourself falling in this spectrum? And a bunch of personal questions that, when they go back and take their lecture review quiz, they're able to answer. So let me pop back onto this other one. So that's a very great way to use this tool and make it an active environment for students. And it can be used in any course on any topic. If you have questions, they have to answer them. It's a great way to add rigor as well, because if they answer some but not all questions, well, there you go. And if they add the questions you ask have definitive answers, well, then you can grade on that as well. So you can see how rigor is being built here, relevance is being built here, and relationships are being built here. So this is a great way to hit all three of those R's. Let's look at option 2. You can use this tool as a sounding board to see how much they're understanding and grasping. If you're teaching a very difficult subject, if you're say a vet or medical instructor and you're in pharmacology or some crazy subjects that you know that students are probably struggling with, and they may not want to ask questions in the classroom, because that often happens. I don't want to feel like the stupid one that has to ask a question on this. You can make the lecture review a sounding board for finding out how well they're understanding things, taking a temperature of the classroom. And same with online. If you're teaching finance or math or subjects like this is a great tool to help the student get a better understanding. So the way this goes is you say, what was one thing we talked about in lecture that you would like further details or clarification on? What was one thing that wasn't totally clear to you before you continue on with your weekly learning? And then you say, if you were able to grasp everything, tell me about something that it would have been nice to hear in the lecture that I didn't mention. And that way it gives them an opportunity. If they understood everything, they now have to go dig through the reading and through everything else that we did that week and say, you know what, I didn't really understand much of this, and they have to put that in there. And then of course you always in lecture reviews have to make sure that there is enough rigor to gain 5 points. So you always put in the disclaimer in the second paragraph as you answer the question. You have to really explain it and go into detail, provide details. Yeah, absolutely, Jennifer. And that way, you know, it makes it more universal, because some people are going to be like, oh, I didn't have any problems, I understood everything. But this forces everybody to answer. So it's a great tool for you, because then as you're building your lectures for future quarters, if you're seeing a couple people saying the same thing, oh, I'd really like you to talk more on this, insert that into your lecture for the future. And if a lot of people are saying, I need more clarification on how to do future value of currency, then you know what? There you go. I need to explain this better in my lecture next time. So it really helps you deliver better lectures. I told you it'd be a tool for both of you. And another popular way is to just make it a summative assessment of the whole thing. And in this way, you just say, hey, submit a response. You should write 1 paragraph for each lecture. This is for somebody who usually posts 2 to 3 lectures a week and makes them short, you know, like 3 5-minute lectures on 3 different topics. And so this week they said there are 2 lectures this week that illustrates something you learned or how something from the lecture could be useful to you in the future. So it asks them to apply something that they learned to a future career. And in order to get the points, you write that they have to illustrate that you fully understand the material. So this is a great way, if you have multiple topics that you're speaking on in your lecture, to get them to weigh in on those multiple topics. If you're teaching residentially, you can use this tool and maybe give it more than 5 points, because in the residential world you're allowed to do that. So maybe you give this, 15 points a week, and then you have them comment on, the 5 or 6 major topics that you talked about in lecture that week. And that way it's reinforcing what they're learning, making them think about it again, making them comment on it again, and kind of drilling it in their heads. So there's your summative. Number 4 is theoretical or applied questions based on your lecture. So this one changes it a little, and you can get specific about what you are learning in lecture. So this one was from a supervisory class and says, in this week's lecture we learned about the 5 functions of management. Choose 2 functions and explain how your current or past supervisor has either been successful or unsuccessful at carrying out these functions. So that makes them actually apply the concepts to a real life experience that they've already had, because most people will have had a supervisor, even if it's at McDonald's, they've had a supervisor before, and they'll be able to really apply what they've learned in this assessment. And then also, of course, as we saw in example number 2, you have to give something for people who've never had a supervisor. If you had never had a supervisor, how do you ensure that you will carry out at least 2 of these functions in your future career? So you can make it more universal again. And then you give the second paragraph, like always, saying the answer should be at least 2 paragraphs, and it needs to be detailed enough to gain the full 5 points. So there you go. There's 4, and I even have a 5th one. You can make it a multiple choice test. That's right. That is allowed, and that is very easy to do because Blackboard gives you the tool right in there. All you have to do is type in 5 multiple choice questions for the 5-point quiz based on what you talked about in lecture, and there you have it. They've got their quiz for a week. This one is more time intensive on your part, having to create the quizzes each week, and it's probably the least involved of all the lecture reviews for the student. All they have to do is click A, B, C, or D 5 times. They're done for the weeks. Quick for them. They aren't going to take away as much as they are in the other ones, but it's still individualized to that unit. So it's still better than the original placeholder. Now what I wanted to pop back on and show you in a couple of these, number 2 says it in a great way when we're using it as a sounding board for understanding, where we're saying, hey, how can I better answer your questions? And then you'll see in the summative, there's also a second paragraph which did the same thing. This is a great time to ask any questions you may have. I will be grading these prior to the assignments being due so I can provide any clarification you may need. This is great to use anytime you do one of these, because if you're in a residential classroom and a student doesn't want to ask you a question, this gives them another outlet. If you are hybrid or online, you don't see your students or rarely see them, this gives them a weekly outlet to ask you questions that they know you're going to see right away, and maybe even see before they email you. And this gives you a way to work through answers with them to their questions in a graded format. Just include it with the feedback, send it their way, and you're good to go. So all 5 of these great options for you. And we just have to remember 3 guidelines. Number 1, when you're creating these, make the work equitable to the point total. If it's only 5 points, don't make them write 7 paragraphs and cite sources, because number 1, the students aren't going to do it. They're going to say, I don't need those 5 points. And number 2, it's just downright mean to force other students who want those points to have to do that much work for such little reward. So make sure that if you're going to make them do more, if it's a residential or hybrid setting, you can award more points. So make sure you're awarding enough points to make whatever you're assigning worth it. In the online world, since we can't change the point totals, but we can change this lecture review quiz format, just make sure what you're assigning equals those 5 points. The second thing, whatever you turn this quiz into, it should assess their learning and understanding of the lectures that they just listened to. If you just always ask that question as you're creating it. Did I assess their understanding? Did I assess that they've learned this material? And finally, remember, for online people who are listening in, the number of questions on this quiz can be changed. The delivery verbiage can be changed, but the point totals cannot, because that's part of the accreditation for online delivery. It all has to meet contact hours and all that fun stuff. So, hooray. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention, and I'm going to pop back. Just give me a second. I'm going to pop on to Campus Connect actually, and let me present my desktop, because For those of you maybe in a residential or hybrid world who haven't used this tool before, and even for some online people who, it, even though we've been doing it for, what now, almost 2 years, it's still easy to get tripped up on this one part. And so let me hold on a second. So I'm going to make sure you guys are entering the feedback in the correct area. Let me pop this over my other screen. I will present my desktop. Give it a couple seconds to load. Now I'm going into an old course, so just so you guys know, you'll see grades and everything in the Grade Center. It's a 2-year-old course. I'm going to go into my Grade Center and I'm going to, long ago, I'm going to grade a lecture review. Now, when you get onto the lecture reviews and you see the question, you see their answers, and then you're going to see 3 boxes for grading input. Most people will see the first box that says response feedback, and that's where they'll put their feedback to the learner. This is the wrong place to put your feedback. It is wrong because that is the feedback on that question. If this was a 20-question quiz, Blackboard always gives you the option to give feedback on every additional or every single question. If they actually go back into their quiz, not into the Grade Center, but back into their actual quiz and go look in there, they'll see this feedback. 99% of students will not ever do that. What they will do is go into the Grade Center and see what feedback you've left them. That is right here in the second box where it says feedback to learners. So make sure when you're doing these lecture reviews and providing this wonderful, valuable feedback to learners, make sure that you're putting it in the second box and not the first or third. That third box is just to give you notes. So you can say, oh, here's some notes I wanted to make on this, on why I graded it the way I did. As a student, I've tried to go back and look at what I put in for lecture review response, and I can't see that. Should I be able to? Yes, if you go back into the actual quiz, your submission, you should be able to go in and see what you put. Not if you can't see it from the Grade Center, however. And that's where this tricky part gets in, where you may not even see the feedback that the instructor left because they put it in that first box, and that and your answer as a student are both in the actual quiz back in the unit content area. And so just make sure as an instructor you're putting it in that second box, and then students will quickly, easily be able to see it whenever they click on their score for that quiz. All right, I have given 5 different options for lecture reviews. I've given you 3 general guidelines to go by, and I've given you the 3 R's, which, if you don't remember them, are to make it rigorous, relevant, and build relationships. If you remember all of those things, well, at least the 3 R's and the 3 guidelines, you should be able to create some wonderful lecture reviews for both your online and residential classrooms that will really help you better understand how your students are interpreting your lectures and help the students really reinforce what they learned in lectures. So now I'm going to open the floor up and say to all of you in the crowd here, have you had any success personalizing your lecture reviews? And if so, what kind of method did you use? Did you use one of the 5 that was listed up here? Do you go a totally different way? That would be great to share with the audience. Have you never done this before, but one of those 5 options really stood out as something that could be useful in your class? Huh? There you go. Well, I'm glad I shined some light on for you. I know I think we've mentioned it in the past, but we haven't really driven the point home, which we probably should. Oh, that's great. Jennifer has them work out math problems that were demonstrated in the lecture for the lecture review quiz. And in classes like that, where they're very quantitative in nature and you can really, they're having to learn things like in finance, math, it's great to be able to, even writing it in a composition class, you could have them work through some writing problems in this format. That's great. I like it. Amy hasn't done it, but she's eager to do it. Yes, yeah, Jennifer writes that she has a hard time entering equations and math symbols. But yes, that is exactly what I was going to give for advice. You can always take screenshots and throw in the pictures, and that works for if you want to put in any pictures. Let's say you're doing something on medical terminology or anatomy and physiology or something, you can throw in a diagram on there or a picture of a skeletal system and ask them, what's this part that I've circled here? And it could be another way of doing it. And Sherry writes, I always change my questions, but I find that students don't necessarily answer the question I ask. I have the ability to track who has viewed the lectures, and I've caught students doing lecture reviews they haven't even signed up to view the lectures. And that's part of the problem with having those placeholders, I think, because students who take online classes are so used to seeing lecture reviews that they don't even read the directions anymore. They're just so used to saying, oh, I gotta write 2 to 3 sentences, let me just write 2 to 3 sentences. They'll see the title of the lecture, and I'll just write 2 to 3 sentences and get out of it. And that's definitely a problem, and that's why we really want to get this changed so they're all personalized. Every time a student goes in there, they don't know what they're going to get. This is going to be a legit quiz on what I just learned. So that's a great point to bring up, Sherry. And Brenna said, I was teaching a short lesson on parallelism for PD students, and I included a poorly written example. Nice. And had them rewrite it. It was only 5 bullets, but it was something they needed to know, not only for the workplace, but also on academic presentations. So that's great. Yeah, absolutely. Put samples from what you just talked about right in that quiz and make them draw the conclusions. That's great. And Richard said, in a class requiring access to a website with password given by the professor, I mentioned the password only in the lecture and asked them what the password was. And that's great. There's your proof that they watched it, to make sure that they're including those things. And that kind of goes with option 1, where they have to answer questions that were given throughout your lecture. So that's great. That's making sure that they're not just sleeping through all these lectures, but they're actually listening and learning, and that's something they definitely needed to know in order to get their assignments done. That's what the password was to that website. Great. Yeah, these are great ideas, and like I said, those 5 options are by no means the only options you have. You can really make these however you want to drive home your lectures and make sure students are getting it. Oh, that's great. That's multiple people doing that. Wonderful. So now I'm going to open it up to any questions you may have. I'll answer any questions that are based on the quizzes themselves, or the rules behind what you can and can't do for quizzes, or any questions you have just on recording lectures in general, I can answer. I'm glad to really just answer anything you guys got now. So I'll pause and let's see if anybody has anything. You'll have to excuse my clicking as I'm copying down the attendance list here before I lose you all. All right, a silence has grown over the community. That's a good sign, I guess, that nobody has any questions on anything. All right, this will be recorded, and I'll send out a link so that you guys can always refer back to this. And and the examples and the R's and everything for when you are creating your own lecture review quizzes. And I thank you all for attending today. And if you're in an area where it's sunny, get out and do it and enjoy it. And if you're down in Florida, I'm thinking about you, and brace for it.